on the top.
God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay.
Is it too early, do you think, to start talking about Christmas? People have been talking about Christmas this week, mostly in terms of it being cancelled for 2020, what with the PM saying on Tuesday that we're going to have tighter restrictions for 6 months than we did over the summer. Although I notice it hasn't stopped Morrison's optimistically putting out a few Christmas-themed things on their shelves. Well, is it too early to talk about Christmas? We've been reading the book of Ruth this month at Aldridge Parish Church, and whereas it starts very much on a harvest theme, it ends in chapter 4, which we're looking at today, on a kind of Christmassy theme. So whether Christmas 2020 is going to happen or not, and knowing full well that really it's only the end of September, I'm just going to allow myself a short Christmassy moment.
And went to Bethlehem straightway this blessed babe to find.
Ruth Chapter 4 is about the three redeemers. They're a bit like buses, it seems. You wait for one for ages, and then three come along at once. As with the other chapters in this book, Chapter 4 divides into 3 parts, and we meet the first 2 redeemers in part 1. Here's Kate to read it for us.
Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here." And they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself, I cannot do it." Now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was a method of legalising transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from amongst his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah."
Well, I'm not going to recap all that much. One of the upsides of virtual church is that I don't really need to say again what I've already said. I just need to give you a link to it. So if you go to www.aldridgeparish.org.uk/Ruth, you can find the full set of readings which Kate and Jenny and Heather have read. You can find the talks on all of the 4 chapters, plus you can find a little bonus technical note on Ruth chapter 4 verse 5, which I'll mention later. Worth catching up with the books so far, I think, if you've missed the last 3 weeks. In brief, we saw last week in chapter 3 Ruth proposing marriage to Boaz in a way which seems a bit odd to us, but which he understood loud and clear. And we saw Ruth asking him to do that as a guardian redeemer, which is bold because from what we can tell, the role of the guardian redeemer was principally to do with land. If you fell on hard times and you had to sell your land in order to survive, the guardian redeemer, who would be a member of your extended family, had the right and the duty to step in and buy that land and keep it in the family. That is to say, he could redeem the land. We see Jeremiah doing that, incidentally, in Jeremiah chapter 32. However, the role of the guardian redeemer did not extend to marrying the widow of a distant family member, which is what Ruth has asked Boaz to do. But Boaz has agreed. He's been touched and moved by the proposal, and you get the distinct impression that he really wants to marry Ruth because of love. Now, Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, is selling some land. We see that in verse 3, and this is exactly the sort of situation a guardian redeemer is supposed to step into. But here's a slightly tricky thing. Ruth has absolutely committed herself to Naomi, her mother-in-law through Mahlon, the husband she had who has died. So Boaz could step in and redeem the land that Naomi is having to sell, and he could also marry Ruth and count any children that he and Ruth might have as part of Naomi's family, and it would give an extremely happy ending to a story which began with hardship and tragedy. But there is another man who is a closer family member than he is himself. And although that man would not have to marry Ruth, he would have first dibs on Naomi's land as a closer guardian redeemer. And so rather than cause trouble, he resolves to square matters with that man first before he takes any action. And so verse 1 of chapter 4 sees Boaz waiting by Bethlehem's town gate for this man. He doesn't get given a name, so I'll call him Mr. X. He is the first redeemer in this chapter. And so by and by Mr. X saunters past on his way out of the town, and Boaz calls him over, and he's gathered 10 elders as well to join them, verse 2, because these are legal matters which are to be considered. And he says to Mr. X, this Redeemer 1, verses 3 and 4, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. And Mr. X thinks about it for a few seconds, and then he says, I will redeem it. Yes, he says, I will step up. I will do my family duty. I will be the redeemer. Because actually, he figures, he's getting a really good deal here. If he acts as the guardian redeemer, well, then he's supposed to return the land in due course to any heirs who might come along. But what's the situation here? Naomi is a widow with no children. She's also getting on in life, and by her own admission in chapter 1 is unlikely to marry again. Yes, Ruth is in the picture, but Ruth is her daughter-in-law and is from Moab. No one in Bethlehem, he figures, is going to marry Ruth. And even if they did, they wouldn't attach themselves to Naomi's family. It would be a new family unit. So there's never going to be an heir, never, ever, ever. And so the land will always be his. I will redeem it, he says. And so Boaz says, verse 5, on the day that you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Now, I want you to indulge me here because I think this verse should be translated like this. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, I will acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. I won't pause to explain why now, because it's a technical matter and not everyone is going to be interested. But for those who are, if you go to www.aldridgeparish.org.uk/Ruth, you'll find a video called Ruth 4 verse 5, a technical note. And in that I explain a bit more about guardian redeemers, a bit more about levirate marriage, and a bit more about the technicalities of the translation of this verse. So you see, I think what's happening is this. Boaz is saying, go ahead and redeem the land, but you need to know that I'm going to marry Ruth the Moabite. And I'm going to do that in a way which legally recognises any children we may have together as being part of Mahlon's family, part of Naomi's family. I will do it in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. So now the situation has changed for Mr. X, because yes, he may well get a good deal on the land now, but if Boaz and Ruth produce an heir, he will be duty bound to turn the land over to him. He could do exactly what Boaz is doing. He could redeem not only the land, but Ruth too. He could marry her. But to him, Ruth is not worth it. And so he changes his mind. And in verse 6, he starts backpedaling furiously. He says, actually, I can't redeem it because it might endanger my own estate. So, Boaz, you redeem it yourself. I can't do it. Well, he's a ratbag, Redeemer 1. He's all very eager to help out when it's going to profit him. But when it looks as though it's going to cost him, you can't see him for dust. It's worth pausing on that for just a moment, because interestingly, all of this provision in Israelite family law, which meant that you might have the opportunity to act as a redeemer, meant that you had an opportunity to behave like God. God is the ultimate redeemer in the Bible. But here were small ways in which you had a chance to behave like God, to redeem. Well, Mr. X turns out to be the polar opposite to God. He'll take the chance when he thinks there's something in it for him. He doesn't mind looking good then. But if it's going to involve sacrifice, well, then he wants nothing to do with it. Redeemer number 1 in this chapter is a kind of anti-redeemer. But we get to the second redeemer in what happens next. So Mr. X is now out of the way and the pitch is clear for Boaz. And we get this explained in a slightly odd way. So Mr. X has said to Boaz, listen, you can be redeemer. And the writer clearly thinks that this is a slightly strange thing that's about to happen. So he explains it to us in verse 7. He says, now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. He sounds a bit embarrassed, you know. We're a bit funny back in those days. You can imagine, you know, any time you went to the estate agent, you'd come home without a shoe. You'd have to hop around after doing business deals. A funny way of doing things. Well, that's what Boaz has to do. So Boaz removes his sandal and it all becomes formal and legal. And so Boaz steps up. He declares his hand to everybody there. He's very public. He is willing to act as redeemer, and not just of the land in verse 9. He's also going to go beyond the role of the redeemer in verse 10, and he's going to marry Ruth. And so Boaz redeems, and in doing so he gives us a wonderful snapshot of what Jesus has come to do. So remember, Boaz can redeem because he is a relative. He's one of their kin. And he's willing to redeem because he is a good man. He is honourable. He's kind. And he's willing to pay a price in order to redeem. And this is where it starts to move from being harvesty and into being Christmassy. Because for Jesus to redeem us, he had to become our kin. He had to become a close relative. And so when we do get to Christmas, what we are remembering is that Jesus was willing to be born one of us, willing to live as one of us. He went to all those lengths in order that he could be a guardian redeemer for us. God came into the world in that way so that he could be a close relative to you. And like Boaz, he was willing to pay a hefty price for your redemption. This other guy, Mr. X, effectively said, Ruth, you're not worth it. Boaz says, you are. And Jesus says, you are. The Apostle Peter writes this, for you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ. Boaz was willing to sacrifice money to redeem. Jesus sacrificed his own self. To Boaz, Ruth was a destitute outsider, yes, but one who was worth redeeming. And to Jesus, you are the very same thing. In his eyes, you are worth even his own precious blood. Well, the account of Ruth could end there, and it would still be a very happy ending. But it doesn't end there, because there's one more redeemer we need to meet. And here's Jenny with what happens next.
So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David.
And so Boaz and Ruth marry. And we're told that they have a son. And the way the writer puts it makes it very clear that this son is a gift from God. And then a number of slightly odd things start to happen. You see, Ruth becomes a mum, but all the women in the town say, verse 17, Naomi has had a son. Ruth does all the hard work, goes through all the labour, and Naomi gets all the congratulations cards. Well, the other slightly odd thing that happens is that the women refer to this baby as the Redeemer. Look at what they say to Naomi in verse 14. They say, Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. And you hear that and you think, they must be talking about Boaz. Boaz has come in, he saved the day, and now she's got this child in her family. But speaking about this Redeemer, listen to what they say. They say, May he become famous in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. The Redeemer isn't Boaz here. The Redeemer is the baby, the third Redeemer in Ruth chapter 4. there is a sense in which the baby has redeemed Naomi's fortunes. Through this baby, Naomi has a lasting place in God's people. This baby is Naomi's redeemer. But there's actually even more to it than that. Because the next strange thing that happens is in verse 17. After they say, Naomi has had a son, look at this, the women of the town name the child. We don't see Boaz and Ruth with a book of baby names having a debate over what to call him. No, it's the women of Bethlehem who name him Obed. And the reason for that is that he's not just there to redeem Naomi. Yes, he will, in verse 15, he will renew her life and sustain her in her old age. But also in verse 14, may he become famous throughout Israel. And the reason is this. In this town of Bethlehem, a Redeemer has been born who will be for all the people. And the end of this chapter shows us how. We end with this little genealogy. I know usually when we see these in Scripture, we just tend to skim read them or even skip over them or just ignore them. But it's important, this genealogy, and so here's Heather to read the last few verses of this book to us.
The genealogy of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram. Ram the father of Amminadab. Amminadab the father of Nahshon. Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon the father of Boaz. Boaz the father of Obed. Obed the father of Jesse. And Jesse the father of David. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, if you're expecting a child right now, I hope that's given you some ideas for baby names. If you're having twins, maybe you could call them Amminadab and Salmon. But look, what the writer is doing here is he is panning out from this family and from this town, and he's showing us how what's just happened fits into the wider purposes of God. Because this genealogy ends with David. We don't know a great deal about the other characters, but we do know about David. We know who David is. Now, back in the beginning of this book, we were told that all of these events happened in the days of the Judges, chapter 1, verse 1. And if you know anything about the book of Judges, you'll know that that was a horrific time to be around. Really horrible things happened at that time. And as things get worse, the writer of the book of Judges inserts this refrain several times. Here's an example from Judges 17, verse 6. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And then it comes a few more times, and then the very end of the book has the same statement. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. The great problem was that in those days they didn't have anyone to bring them under God's rule. And yet now we see that through this birth to this obscure Moabite girl, apparently a nobody, God is going to provide a king who himself points forward to the greater king. Because this genealogy at the end of Ruth 4 makes a reappearance in Matthew chapter 1, where it is extended all the way down to Jesus. And it's a reminder to us that, like Israel, we have suffered the absence of a king in our lives. By nature, we've said, we will do what is right in our own eyes. We will do as we see fit. And wonderfully, God has acted to meet our need. And because he has, and because that King came, because that Redeemer entered this world, we now have a place among God's people. And we have an inheritance that will never perish or spoil or fade. The book, which begins with tragedy and grief, ends with peace. It's not just a happy ending for the characters in the book. It's a happy ending for us. The story of Naomi and Ruth is the story of us.